Hey everyone, I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's case study. So, I have been really looking forward to this interview for a while for a whole bunch of reasons. But let me first say, this is Tom Olverson. He's from RG 175, former head of school. Tom's gonna introduce himself in just a second. But before I do, I just have to tell a story. So it may have been Tom. When did I talk to the RG 175 team? Like 3 or 4 months ago, 5 months ago,
Yes.
something like that. So I had this presentation that I talk about, like why I think the independent school model needs to be reimagined. I've got to put a lot of thought and energy into it and a lot of research into it. And so I got invited to speak to all the consultants at RG 175. Super excited, especially because I knew Tom was there, and Tom and I had collaborated when I was at EMA, and I've just always thought so highly of him. And I knew that he has like similar ideas about like reimagining the model that I do. So we get on the call. I'm super excited. I see Tom. I start giving this talk. At the end, got a whole bunch of questions, but nothing from Tom. Nothing. So I was like, did I just completely miss the mark? Like, what is going on here? So I emailed Tom. Do you remember I emailed you the next day? I think I was like, hey, like I was so excited to talk to you. Like, what was going on? And then he's like, Peter, like my mind was like racing as you were talking. I just didn't have time to answer the question because Tom just wrote a book called, Leading Through Strategy, which gets into a lot of the work that I'm doing, but he frames it through his stories as a head of school and provides just incredible knowledge. And Tom, I apologize. I usually don't wax on this long in my intros, but I was just so excited that it's just such a fun moment for me. But welcome to this case study. Thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you, Peter.
All right. So, Tom, just let's take a second. So, a lot of people who are watching this, I'm sure, have met you or are familiar with you. But for those who haven't, can you just talk a little bit about yourself and your backstory?
Sure. Well, first of all, Peter, thank you so much for having me on your this broadcast. I really appreciate it. I know a lot of our interests overlap right now. I'm not exactly sure where they overlap, and at some
Right.
point, maybe during this conversation, we'll figure that out. But I'm
Sure.
super excited about being with you this afternoon. So I have been a consultant with Resource Group 175 for the last 10 years. My work is primarily focused in three areas. One is doing head of school searches, in which I'm primarily dealing with the board of trustees directly. Secondly, I mentor about 5 heads throughout the country each year, and that has been a great source of knowledge for me. And then thirdly, I started the RG 175 blog back in 2015 or so. And really did most of the entries during those early years, and now share it with other members of the firm. Before I joined RG 175, I was a head of school at 2 different schools, Seabury Hall in Hawaii, which is a 6 through 12 school, about 500 students, Episcopal day school. And then from 1997 to 2014, I was the head of the River School, just outside of Boston, 6 through 12, 525 students. And a lot of the examples in my book, Leading Through Strategy, come from my experience at Rivers.
Yeah. So why is now the right time? Well, first, give us a little bit of an overview of the book. And the question I have is, like, why is now the right time to write this?
So, I guess, what really prompted me to write this, first of all, on a practical level, I was going through recovery from a foot surgery. So I had plenty of time to sit around and do some thinking. And one of the things that, I really reflected on, and this has been with me for really the last 8 or 9 years as I've done consulting work, and that is the similarity of strategic plans among so many schools throughout the country. And I pondered it, and it's become a stronger and stronger observation as I've gone through my consulting. And I pondered, why is that? Why are they so similar? And I concluded albeit without empirical evidence. But I surmise that the reason is that the real driver for the formulation of strategic goals in most strategic plans is what other schools are doing. That's what's driving them. Just think about it, Peter, and you've seen this. So a new head comes in. Gosh, at my old school, this was an incredibly successful program. Let's do it here.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Or a head goes to a conference, and this is the hot issue. This is the hot program, and we want our school to keep up, and therefore we're going to adopt this program and make it a part of our strategic plan. Or a trustee. Here's a classic one. We've seen this. Trustee looks at the prestigious school across town, sees that they're doing this incredible signature program, and that we need to adopt that program.
Right. Right.
So the generator, the real set of assumptions that are driving or that are generating strategic goals are all coming from what other schools are doing. And even, what in my observations, I think most strategic plans are basically essentially solving a bunch of problems, perceived problems. But even in solving those problems, what's going on is that they're only perceived problems because of what other schools are doing. And so it just seemed, and I tend to come at issues through a marketing perspective, independent school issues, and it just seemed odd to me, that we're trying to differentiate ourselves, but we have a lot of strategic plans that are pretty darn similar to each other. And I remember my colleague Tom Hudnut told me once, that if you continue trying to keep up with the Joneses, then eventually you're going to become the Joneses. And that is not an enviable marketing position to be in, and especially today with some of the challenges that independent schools are facing. So that was one strand. And then I thought about, another strand was just reflecting on my experience at Rivers and how I sort of intuitively took a different approach to strategy. And I don't really know why. I think it probably had to do with a pretty quick realization that this was a highly competitive market and I needed to do something different. And so intuitively, I approached strategy in a different way.
Was that a mandate from the board when you were hired, or was that just something that you brought to the job?
I just brought to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we get into that, I guess the question I have is, why do we look at the 5 to 10 schools in our market and effectively build strat plans that are in parallel to the competition? I mean, what drives that?
Such a good question. I think there's a lack of imagination and a failure to seek out the creative impulses of people. But I think what really drives it, Peter, is that most schools are not using a marketing lens, and specifically the idea of capturing a market position,
right,
and owning it. They're not. That isn't the driver of decision making. And the easy way to make decisions is just look around and see what other schools are doing.
Yeah, and what you just said is really interesting to me on a couple of levels. One, like when somebody says marketing, I'd love to do like a pulse survey. Like when you hear marketing, what do you think, right? I mean, it could be, hey, it's our website, it's our view book, it's, whatever kind of brand work that we've done, but marketing is a far more analytical science than just those things. It's about understanding your market and then figuring out like where is your sweet spot and how are you going to execute to be able to deliver the most value to people who fall into that category, right? The differentiation piece that you talked about.
Absolutely.
But then, Tom, I'm thinking about you. What year did you start at Rivers? Was it 97?
1997.
And you were there through 14. I mean, it's only been, how long has marketing not been a dirty word in our space? Not long.
Right.
So, how did you realize that marketing wasn't a dirty word in 1997? Because I just remember, back in the 2001, 2, 3, 4, when you would bring up the word marketing, people were like, shh, don't say that word.
Yeah. I never felt like marketing was a dirty word throughout my career. I thought that I knew enough about business that if we were going to feed, program, and feed great experiences to our students, that we needed revenue. And the place where we get revenue is through a strong position in the market where customers feel compelled to choose our service over other services. And so I intuitively understood that. And then when I got to Boston too, the competition there, this, Peter.
Yeah, it's
just so intense. It's not just the day schools, it's boarding schools that have day elements. 25% of their student population are day students.
And the density, 50%. Right? Just the sheer number of schools. The
sheer number of schools makes it really, really difficult. And so I just intuitively felt like I've got to do something different. And then, as I reflected on my experience, I then thought about my first reading of Playing to Win by Roger Martin and A.G. Lafley. A lot of independent schools, administrators have read this book, and it's a very popular book. And Martin and Lafley give a structure to thinking strategically, to doing real strategic thinking that focuses on market and on capturing a market position. And I said to myself, intuitively, I did a lot of that stuff at Rivers. I didn't have the same sophistication that Martin and Lafley, describe in Playing to Win, but I did a lot of this stuff. And so I wondered, could we take that thinking, that sort of disciplined approach to thinking, and apply it to independent schools in order to strengthen their marketing position, or perhaps even abandon their position? There's some schools that need to abandon their market position. All you have to do is look out into the world and see, this ain't going to work anymore, And then there's some schools that need to say, we need to think, we're getting some competition from charter schools and from other independent schools. We need to double down on what we are known for. Now, Peter, here's to close the circle. What if that vision about capturing a strategic position or a marketing position and all that entails, what Martin and Lafley call a winning aspiration, what if that is the driver of the formulation of strategic goals as opposed to what the school down the street is doing?
Well, break that down for me. What might that look like?
It changes everything so that, for instance, in using the example of Rivers, we needed to make a decision at Rivers about what segment of the market we wanted to compete in. And there needed to be a lot of thought about that. The school was in this prestigious athletic league, a lot of old-time schools and so forth and so on, but it really was not, it didn't have that kind of of market strength, or wasn't perceived, as the strongest school. But so we needed to figure out, where do we want to compete? What part of the market? And then we needed to say, okay, within that market, how are we going to differentiate ourselves?
Right.
And my point is, Peter, is that those seem like easy questions now, but it was a struggle just to get to the right questions, much less formulate a plan to capture, to try to capture a position.
I mean, you're talking about deep reflection. What has been thought to be the case for years, all of a sudden you may wake up and realize, what, like, this isn't where we need to be playing in a different place altogether. When you got to Rivers, and in the subtitle of your book, I mean, the headline is Leading Through Strategy, but then you talk about how business principles can help independent schools thrive. How did that start to formulate when you got to Rivers? And, as you're walking me through that, I'm really curious about, how did you instill that in your team, right? Like, because now you're talking about equipping them with skills that they may not have had prior to your arrival.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think leadership within the administrative team, although, lots of talented people, and certainly within the board, just didn't naturally gravitate to a strategic marketing perspective.
Yeah.
And so what I did was I did this sort of rigid SWOT analysis and said, look, let's start telling the truth, because Peter, the mythologies that abound at independent schools are legendary, and they can be incredibly valuable in helping people feel good about the school, but they can be big preventers of change.
Yeah.
They often block change.
Right.
And so I did this SWOT analysis, and basically I became the most knowledgeable person about Rivers after about 6 months on the job.
How did you conduct? I mean, so SWOT analysis, like, somebody watching this may be thinking, okay, we're going to sit around a boardroom, we're going to make the 4 quadrants, and we're going to start filling it in as a group. But that's not what you did, right?
First of all, I did a deep dive into the history of the school. I wanted to understand every phase, what was good, what didn't work, what happened. And, Rivers, interestingly enough, and I mentioned this in the book, was founded as an open air school. So the windows were open, for the first, 13 years. And so when I discovered that they closed the windows after a change of heads, I said, okay, that's it. That's why Rivers struggled for the next 60 or 70 years, because its raison d'etre was lost. There was no purpose anymore. And I can remember sharing that with groups of people, trustees and administrators, and they sort of looked at me like I was a strange, somebody from outer space. But to me, it was really profound. And so I just dug into the history, and then I spent a lot of time with the data. And it's not just spending time, mission statistics for the last 10 years, fundraising, capital campaigns, and so forth, reports, accreditation reports. And it's not just about reading the data and reading the reports, it's interpreting them. It's, what do they tell you about your position in the market and where you are, and your capacity to attract the kinds of, prospective students that you want to attract. Then I interviewed every single teacher. I interviewed every single trustee. I interviewed lots of leaders in the alumni group. And I kept looking for themes.
Yeah, sure.
Broad themes. And then I put all that together in a 10-page report, presented it to the board and to the faculty, and said, this is what I see.
Well, first off, I love not only that you presented to the board, but you presented to the faculty. Talk about that.
Yeah, I took that. I wasn't sure about doing it initially, but I decided to go forward and do it because I said, we got to get everybody on the same page here.
Was this in your first year, by the way, Tom?
Yes.
Okay,
First 6 months. So this was step one, is to present, we're going to do an unvarnished, we're going to find the unvarnished truth here. We're going to strip away the mythologies. Because there were lots of ways in which rivers, and lots of schools do this, where they're rationalizing. Yeah, but we really care about kids. Or rivers, we help kids become their best selves, and so forth and so on. And there was a lot of truth to it. I don't want to discount it. But it also became a rationalization for not taking a good hard look at what you're doing and whether it's working or not.
Right. Just because you've been doing something for a long time doesn't mean you shouldn't re-examine it periodically to understand, is it still effective?
Exactly. And then I got some consensus about that, which was great, because now, especially with the trustees, I could force them out of their, I look at rivers only through the lens of my child's experience, to I need to look at rivers through the lens of, are we in a position to really thrive in the future? And if not, what do we need to do about it? And so at that point, about a month later, I came back and said, okay, folks, to the faculty and to the board, here are 4 identities. I did, 2 or 3 paragraphs. Here are 4 ways in which we can be known in the independent school market in Boston, in which, and all 4 of them could, lead to attracting students. And I made them vote. I said, pick one. I made the board vote, and I made the faculty vote. And I said, I can't help rivers become the best rivers until we figure out what it is that we want to be.
Boy, that's putting you in a kind of vulnerable spot, don't you think?
Hugely.
Yeah.
And I kind of knew where they were going to go.
Well, because you had interviewed all the faculty, so I imagine you were picking up those themes. Yeah.
And all the and all the trustees as well.
Sure.
So I kind of knew where they were going to go. And basically they chose the identity that said, look, we're in the ISL. We're proud of being in this prestigious athletic league. We want to be a good school among good and great schools. And that's what we want to do. And caring about kids and beyond just academics is something that has always been a part of the Rivers, ethos. And we don't want to lose that. We don't, a lot of competitive schools in the Boston area where, kids are spending 6 hours a night doing homework. We don't want to be that. But we clearly want to be in that group of schools that are considered really strong independent schools. And so that's what we want to go after.
And so then you had to figure out how to differentiate within that.
So category. How do you do that? But at least we had consensus, because what I didn't want to do, Peter, is I didn't want to keep relitigating this identity issue. I want to keep going back and saying, well, who are we? What are we trying to do? And so forth and so on. I wanted, if we were going to move forward, we had to develop a consensus. And once we developed that consensus, I could go back and say, hey guys, remember the vote we took? You said, this is what we want.
Right.
Now that we know what we want to be known for, let's figure it out.
What's interesting about that, Tom, is like you're struggling with the tension of the market's telling you one thing, and then you've got this mission that you've been serving for a long time. And like, it may mean that the market's dictating, well, you got to live your mission in a different way.
Could be.
Yeah.
So, and that's a critical element that Martin and Lafferty make in Playing to Win. That if you're doing real strategy, it's a risk.
Right.
And if your strategic plan doesn't feel like a risk,
Right.
then it's just a plan.
Right.
And I love the way Martin and Lafley actually Roger Martin in his YouTube video on, a plan is not a strategy.
Right. Exactly.
A plan is just about inputs. It's just about, things that the school has control over. Like we're going to renovate the dining room. We're going to create a leadership center. We're going to raise teacher salaries. But there's no connection between those inputs and ultimately what you want customers to do. There's this sort of vague, maybe if we create a center for leadership, maybe our reputation will improve and maybe we'll get more kids. But there's no real connection between that position that you want to own in the market,
right,
and the inputs. And what Martin and Lafley say is, no, you got to start with the outputs first. Right. You got to start with the risk taking. You got to say, you've got to say, what can we do to compel customers to come to our school?
Right.
And so now, going back to your original question about what does that all mean, it's like now you're planning backwards. Now the Center for Leadership may not mean that much, but rather you're demonstrating to parents that you deeply care about these kids, and you're showing them so that they're going to go out and talk about, I just can't believe how well Rivers knows my kid.
Yeah. Look, the way I interpret that is like, what is your audacious vision and how do you convey that into the market? And then, okay, great. You're going to then work backwards, and over the next 3 years, like these are the things that we need to do in order to realize that vision. However, like be really clear as a leader that when you break down that 3-year plan into the 1-year plan that you're currently operating, you got to break that down into quarterly goals so that you can hold people accountable. You make it clear where you're going as an institution. And by the way, when you get done with that 1-year plan, that 3-year plan is probably going to look a little bit different because you're learning things about market realities. But like, how do you then reorient it to that big vision that you have so that you are living, whatever it is you promise to the market?
And of course, everything depends on the school, and that's what's so disturbing about new heads of school coming in and not analyzing the market and not asking profound questions. Or, gosh, are we losing our hold over this market or this position? Is this, considering the events that are happening locally, nationally, internationally, is this a realistic position, over 10, 15, 20 years? And that's why, it's so important for boards and schools to play the long game.
Yeah. So a couple questions as we start to wrap up. One of the things that struck me in the book was that you had a really good mentor, that the board had equipped you with a firm or a person at a firm who was able to really challenge you and your team over a sustained period of time. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It was fortuitous. The board didn't set me up with this person. Well, okay. One trustee set me up with this person.
Right.
So I went to this trustee and said, boy, I'd love for you to join the advancement committee. He said, I'm not really interested in fundraising. What I really am interested in is strategic marketing. And this guy was one of the founders of the Monitor Group, which is now part of Deloitte Strategy. Monitor was came out of the Harvard Business School, and their professors. So he hooks me up with this guy, one of the leading marketing strategists in the world. He's written a cover article for the Harvard Business Review. Peter, for 9 years, I got free advice from this guy. And he came to it strictly from a business perspective. Now, it was up to me to translate that into the educational world. But for 9 years, I got this counsel, and it confirmed. Not only did it confirm a lot of my initial instincts in terms of the work that I did early on at Rivers, but it also strengthened those instincts and introduced me to new concepts. Like
Right.
just to mention a couple here, the concept of table stakes. What do you need to do to prove that you are legitimately a part of that segment, that marketing segment? And two, the concept of drivers and barriers in terms of customer behavior. What's going to drive them to your school? What's going to be a barrier to them going to your school?
Did it take you a while to like actually think, customers? You know, like you don't hear schools talking about customers so much, but like that's an interesting word choice for you.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I learned how to talk differently to different stakeholder groups. So I would never use customers in front of faculty. I tried to turn the conversation. In fact, rarely did I talk about marketing with the faculty. I just talked about an aspiration and how they could make a difference in achieving this aspiration. And one of the problems with a lot of strategic plans, Peter, is that they really kind of come down to top-down management. So they don't give enough room for faculty to play in a sandbox and help create ideas that reinforce the narrative that you want to be out there in the public. I want them to be story generators so that I can go out and say, see, we are this school. The school that we claim to be, we are that school.
Which fuels the word of mouth and all the good things that come from that. Hey, so two last questions. So you wrote this book. The timing is interesting, right? You've been working with schools for 10 years in a consulting capacity. Like, as you're looking out over the next 10 years or even, beyond that, like, what is your outlook in terms of sustainability for the market for independent schools? Like, and what would you recommend that they do?
First question in terms of outlook, I can't say that I'm super optimistic. I think we need more heads of school. I love the fact that heads of school are educators. I think that's important. They know how to inspire people, inspire faculty, and talk the language. But I think that that's not enough. I think they've got to become CEOs as well. And I think they have to think about business and business strategy and look at their school through that lens. And I think that's super important. And I think that the organizations like yours really are doing really important work to change this mindset, because I'm not seeing it in the traditional organizations.
Well, you asked early, like at the beginning of the interview, you were like, well, maybe we'll discover where, our interests overlap. And you just absolutely like pinpointed it right there. I mean, Tom, I've spoken, I don't even know, over 100 heads at this point, maybe more. I've covered, honestly, I've lost count. And, when I asked them the question, like, what point before you became head did you receive any kind of business or entrepreneurial training? The answer 97% of the time is none. And, that's not an indictment on anyone. It's just not been part of the workflow in terms of leadership development. And I think, if you're going to run an organization that has a budget of 10 million, 20, 30, 40, 50 million with, lots of people's livelihoods dependent on making good decisions, like that is going to be, that's why I founded this organization, is to equip leaders with those skills so as they progress throughout their career, they're just put in better position. They're put in positions to be successful in a way that maybe they wouldn't be otherwise.
And Peter, to your point, I mean, what other organizations are teaching heads to think this way?
I don't know. I mean, that's obviously the bet I'm making with my organization. But, I think that, there's very clear lanes in which people have been trained in our space, and they've been built over decades, right? And to bring something new just requires creating a new lane. And I don't think any organization that's supporting heads is intentionally leaving this out. I just think that's just not been part of their lane, right?
I agree.
Yeah. So I think this is the opportunity. Like, this is where I get really excited about the future of independent schools, is that if we can start to, teach these skills in ways that just haven't yet, or, have been piecemeal, or, people are trying to connect the dots. Like, I think we stand a chance to have schools do really interesting things in the future.
And that's the reason I wrote the book.
Yeah.
Just try to get those ideas out there.
Yeah.
To have heads think differently and trustees think differently about the future of their schools.
That's the opportunity, right? That is, like, there's just, independent schools are incredible places that have incredible value to share in the market. It's just that we need to think about how do we position ourselves so that prospective families understand it, right? And also think about different ways in which we can scale it. Like, there's lots of room within the model to do interesting things.
Right. And, I just, one quick point, you mentioned about entrepreneurial thinking. I mean, listen, a lot of educators are pretty risk averse. And so it's not necessarily in their nature, which means that they do need training in this. And if you're going to strengthen your position, the school's position in a market, you've got to understand that, number one, it's a bet, and number two, you got to make choices.
Right.
I mean, think of all the schools, Peter, that you deal with that try to straddle two market segments. It doesn't work.
The way I always frame it is like, there's this inclination to be like, we need to be all things to all people, right? And but I think there's like the next part of the sentence is missing, which is like, that's a tough promise to keep, because we just don't generate enough revenue to do all things really, really well.
Right. We don't generate enough revenue, and it's impossible. We're asking our people to try to innovate in so many different spaces.
Right.
But if you give them, real creativity comes when you put a fence around them and say, you get to innovate in this space.
Right.
And your innovation needs to help us win that market position.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I think it's a question of teaching new vocabulary so people understand that it is okay to think about, apply those kind of principles to schools, and just continuously training leaders at every level, from like the assistant director of slide in your department all the way up to the board chair, like, creating this kind of shared vocabulary and shared view on how to grow the school. Tom Olverson, you've been super kind with your time. I'm just going to put this up here one more time. Let me see. There it is. Leading Through Strategy. I obviously will include a link to the book in the show notes, but just thank you. Congratulations on this. I know it was a big lift. It's a big lift to write a book, and I just wish you continued success with it.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter, for having me.
Oh, you got it. Thank you.